What's up guys, I'm Rootkits. So today I'm going to be making a video on basically techniques that hackers are now using for malware, new techniques. So I'm really into malware and I haven't really seen a video on this yet, and it was very interesting to me when I first saw it, so I thought I would share it with you guys. Basically, so attackers now are more and more using virtual machines for their malware. Now this is mainly to evade antiviruses, and the first example we have seen about this with this technique into the wild is Ragnar Locker. This was from about a year ago, so it's still relatively new. And the way that Ragnar Locker worked actually was, so it had two files behind it mainly. It was a 122 megabyte installer and a 282 megabyte virtual disk. This virtual disk actually did have a 49 kilobyte payload. This was the encryption payload basically. And the damage behind this ransomware, so the hackers did demand about 1,600 Bitcoin, which was worth $11 million at the time, roughly. Now, I'm not sure if all $11 million was paid or not. I do know that about $4.5 million was paid, unfortunately, to the hackers. And if you're in a position whether to pay or not to pay for ransomware if you got infected, it's a really tough call because if you're going to pay, you're just fueling future ransomware attacks, and you don't even know if you're going to get all your files decrypted or if your data hasn't already been sold or leaked on the dark web. And it's a very stressful situation, so it is tough if you ever get into that. It's a very nasty situation to be into. But back to Ragnar Locker, the way that this worked, so the installer was to a outdated hypervisor, one from 2009, and the virtual disk was to a Windows XP fork, Micro XP, which did have the 49 kilobyte payload. Now, when it comes to virtual machines, the way that the virtual machines do work is that they're basically another operating system running on top of your main one. So typically, if you're on Windows, you can run Linux virtually through a hypervisor, a VM manager, basically as a virtual machine. And I do have a video up on how to make up a malware lab with virtual machines, and typically they're not allowed to communicate to each other because basically you can choose whether or not they can. And one of the ways you can choose is through a shared folder. So for example, a directory on your host can communicate to your guest through that only one directory or whatever you specify. Or of course your network, you can specify a lot. But basically the shared folder is kind of what Ragnar did. So what Ragnar would do is first it would try to disable antivirus and notifications so they wouldn't alert you, but they would start mounting your drives. And when they would mount your drives, basically after they disabled the antiviruses and they had all your drives mounted, they would delete local backups and they would start encrypting your files. So this is a diagram. It's kind of blurry, but basically once the installer would install the hypervisor and the virtual disk, then the payload would be ran. It was a batch file that initiated the exe actually. And from here they would try to disable antiviruses and then go ahead and mount all your drives and then start encrypting stuff. So it's smart because on a task manager and what you would see on process manager, you would only see that the hypervisor is actually communicating to your host operating system. So you wouldn't see the specific file, the ragnar.batch or whatever it was, communicating that's encrypting all your files. It would only appear that VirtualBox is actually doing it, for example. We've all been inside for quite a while over the past year because of the pandemic. COVID really got us all inside on our computers a lot more than we should be. And with this, a lot of malware came, such as this one. So these techniques are, increasing in volume, and hopefully we can find solutions to them.